There's no reason for us to deploy, ma'am.
Well, then you should say no, right?
Yes, but just point of clarification. Homeland Security investigations, we do investigate voter fraud, which we've made several arrests, most recently a high-profile one in Massachusetts. So just later on...
That's very different than the physical intimidation.
I just didn't want you to say that we don't do anything with voter. I just want you to know we do that.
That's fine.
What started as a routine immigration hearing quickly turned into a stunning confrontation over the future of American elections. Senator Elissa Slotkin repeatedly pressed acting ICE Director Todd Lyons on one question: if President Trump ordered ICE agents to surround polling places during the midterms, would he say no? His answer, and what came next, left the hearing on edge. Here's exactly what happened.
Senator Slotkin.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I personally think that Secretary Noem should be here. You want the big job, you have the big accountability, and we should be seeing the Secretary of Homeland Security coming in front of the American people and certainly the Oversight Committee when we have such existential issues about the deployment of federal force in our country going on. But you are here in her place. And I think, you know, if we rewound the tape to a year and a half ago or a year plus ago, you had a lot of Americans who felt very strongly that if you are here illegally, especially if you were involved in any kind of criminal activity, you should be deported, right? You need strong borders. I'm a CIA officer. You need strong borders. We need an immigration policy that allows us to do that, but that enforcement would have been something that the average American supported. But the conduct of ICE in places like Minneapolis has now boomeranged to the point where people say, well, look, I was for enforcement, but I'm not for what looks like authoritarian style, federal goons on our streets. And that's not coming from Democrats. That's coming from, in Michigan, the state of Michigan voted for Donald Trump. It's coming from people who say, look, I'm all for enforcement, but I'm not for trampling basic rights. And Americans have an internal barometer for what looks and smells authoritarian, and whether it's shooting someone who's unarmed or pepper spraying kids or picking people up as they walk into Target and checking their papers, that is an internal barometer that we all have, that you have crossed. And we're here today, and all this firestorm is here, not because of people on the ground, but because of your behavior in ICE. And, I think when you extrapolate out and you listen to what the president and his cabinet are saying, I have to ask about our 2026 elections. Okay? The president says we should federalize our elections, even though the U.S. Constitution was written by our founders to give that power to the states so that we would never have a president who took too much power and tried to become a king. He's tried to get voter rolls, including in my state. He's complained that elections aren't free and fair. In 2020, he came up with a playbook to deploy federal law enforcement around polling places, and the White House spokeswoman will not rule that out as of a month and a half ago. So I have to ask Mr. Lyons, do you believe that ICE has the authority to be deployed to U.S. polling places around the country?
So, ma'am, we're civil. Obviously, we do civil enforcement and criminal law enforcement. There's no reason for us to deploy to a polling facility.
So if the President of the United States gets Kristi Noem on the phone and she gets you on the phone and she says, we've heard there's a problem in Georgia or in Michigan or somewhere else, I need you to go and physically deploy around polling locations, you will say no.
There's no reason for us to deploy, ma'am.
Well, then you should say no, right?
Yes, but just point of clarification. Homeland Security investigations, we do investigate voter fraud, which we've made several arrests, most recently a high-profile one in Massachusetts. So just later on...
That's very different than the physical intimidation.
I just didn't want you to say that we don't do anything with voter. I just want you to know we do that.
That's fine. I'm talking about something that I think would be extraordinary in American history, which is uniformed and masked ICE agents encircling polling places. And it's not fantasy, it's not made up. These are things that the president and his cabinet have suggested. They've suggested invoking the Insurrection Act, which would allow active duty military to do the very same thing. So this isn't, someone who thinks the sky is falling. The president and his cabinet are suggesting. So you're going to be the guy standing in the breach.
There's no reason, like I say, ma'am, there's no reason for you to use ICE officers in that.
Great. Well, I hope that in the privacy of that meeting, when that comes down and the president feels like he's going to lose the midterm elections, that you don't buckle. Because I think our democracy literally is dependent on it. Now, coupled with that, you've heard from a number of my colleagues about labeling people as domestic terrorists. What is the definition of a domestic terrorist?
So, ma'am, domestic terrorist is any organization that, on American soil, home nation soil, that's involved in acts of treason, acts of violence, active extremism against a group or against a country.
Okay, so actually in law, it's defined by the Patriot Act. That's the clearest place we have it. And it has to be tied to criminal activity,
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
So protesting, even if you don't like it, protesting of ICE agents, unarmed and without destroying property, is that a domestic terrorist?
No, ma'am. I stated under oath earlier that that's covered under the First Amendment right.
Great. So when, again, the president and Stephen Miller and others in the cabinet, including your boss, Kristi Noem, label people like Renee Good domestic terrorists, you understand why we can't trust what you're doing with the information you're collecting on these so-called domestic terrorists. So can you tell us under oath, does the Department of Homeland Security maintain a database of any kind of domestic terrorists? Are you collecting facial recognition information, license plates, locations, addresses, those kinds of information?
No, ma'am, and I testified on the oath on Tuesday as well. I said the same thing. We don't have a database. If there is a case, a criminal case, that may involve some type of domestic terrorist organization, Homeland Security, as you know, Homeland Security investigation is involved across the board and embedded with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. We do conduct those, but there is no database, ma'am, for that.
Okay, or do you contribute data to anyone else's, any other federal agency's database?
No, ma'am.
Okay, so the fact that we have ICE agents saying out loud to people that they're trying to arrest or engage with that we're going to put you into a database is just erroneous. They're making that up.
Yes, ma'am, I can't speak to why that officer said it, but we do not do that.
Well, I would just offer that given that the president put out an executive order in September and said he wants a list of domestic terrorist groups to use the full weight of the federal government to go against, you can imagine that people who are peaceful protesters feel like they are going to be targeted and feel that they are at risk. So I think the conduct of your agency has put us in a position where the average American doesn't know whether to trust law enforcement, and that is terrible and scary, given what law enforcement on the ground in our states do. And I would just say, if we do not have serious reform and change, then you will be contributing to the average American who woke up very supportive of law enforcement, being terrified that they and their community will be next. Yield back.
Thank you. We're almost at an end, and I think we've had a good hearing. I think a lot of knowledge came forward, and I sense at least the idea that you guys want to restore confidence in the agencies, and we'll work on that, and I hope that's true. With regard to the thing I mentioned before, I'm going to mention one more time as we end. The Attorney General says he will cooperate with final orders. You got a bunch of final orders. I would love to see you go for some specific people, that you send a letter to the Minneapolis police and say, will you help us? We need 10 policemen to go round up this guy. And then I'd like to see their response. And you should quote him from the hearing. He said he's for final orders. I think that's different than the policy he's been enforcing. So let's challenge him on that. Those are battles you can win. Those are political battles and public relations battles. Also, if you would send to my office specific times when you've been turned down. You've asked for requests. Everybody says they're not helping. I want to know that you're asking and being turned down. That should be publicized, and we're happy to publicize that. I think there are problems on both sides of the equation here, but the way we make them better is by making sure everybody knows about these things. But I do appreciate your cooperation in coming. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. The record for this hearing will remain open until 5 p.m. on Friday, February 13th, 2026 for the submission of statements and questions for the record.
Senator Elissa Slotkin used her time to shift the conversation away from immigration numbers and towards something she argued was even more fundamental: the limits of federal power in a democracy. She began by acknowledging that many Americans support strong border enforcement and the removal of people who commit crimes while in the country illegally. Rather than rejecting immigration enforcement altogether, she argued that public opinion has changed because of how some recent ICE operations have been carried out. According to Slotkin, many voters who once supported stricter enforcement now worry that aggressive tactics have crossed a line, making federal law enforcement appear intimidating rather than protective. That distinction became the foundation of her questioning. She argued that the debate was no longer simply about border security. It was about whether Americans could continue to trust that federal law enforcement would remain independent from political pressure. Slotkin then turned to what became the defining exchange of the hearing. Referring to President Trump's past statements about election integrity and federal involvement, she asked Acting ICE Director Todd Lyons whether ICE officers could ever be deployed around polling locations during future elections. The question was not about investigating election crimes after the fact. It was about the physical presence of uniformed federal agents near voting sites, something critics argue could intimidate voters even if no arrests were made. Lyons responded that he saw no reason for ICE officers to be deployed to polling places. Slotkin immediately narrowed the question further. She asked what would happen if that order came directly from the president through Homeland Security leadership. Would he refuse? Rather than simply repeating that such a deployment was unnecessary, Lyons ultimately agreed that he would say no because ICE had no operational reason to be stationed at polling locations. That exchange mattered because it highlighted one of the central principles of American government: federal law enforcement agencies are expected to enforce the law, not participate in the political process. Elections in the United States are primarily administered by state and local officials, and maintaining public confidence that voters can cast ballots free from intimidation has long been viewed as an essential part of democratic governance. Slotkin next turned to another issue that has generated growing public debate: the use of the term domestic terrorist. She noted that senior administration officials had publicly used that label when discussing some protesters and asked Lyons to distinguish between peaceful demonstrations protected by the First Amendment and criminal conduct that could qualify as domestic terrorism. Lyons acknowledged that peaceful protest is constitutionally protected and should not be considered domestic terrorism. He also stated under oath that ICE does not maintain a database of domestic terrorists and does not contribute information to such a database. When Slotkin referenced reports of officers telling people they would be placed into a database, Lyons said he could not explain those comments but insisted they did not reflect agency policy. That exchange reflected a broader concern about public trust. If people believe lawful political activity could expose them to government surveillance, even without evidence that such a database exists, confidence in public institutions can begin to erode. Slotkin argued that restoring that confidence requires not only lawful conduct but also transparency about what agencies are, and are not, doing. Throughout the hearing, the two sides approached the issue from very different perspectives. Lyons emphasized ICE's responsibility to enforce immigration laws and investigate criminal activity within its legal authority. Slotkin focused on ensuring those enforcement powers remain clearly separated from elections, peaceful political activity, and constitutionally protected speech. The hearing ultimately became less about immigration itself and more about the balance between national security, law enforcement, and civil liberties. Regardless of political affiliation, the exchange underscored a question that continues to shape debates across the country: how can the government enforce the law aggressively while preserving public confidence that federal power will never be used to influence the democratic process? As more oversight hearings continue, lawmakers from both parties are likely to keep pressing administration officials on where those constitutional boundaries lie, and whether Americans can trust that those boundaries will be respected when political pressure is at its highest. If you found this breakdown helpful, subscribe to Floor Report for clear, fact-based coverage of the biggest congressional hearings and the moments that matter most.